Picture the boomers, the ones who rewrote entire cultural movements, who marched and protested and demanded the world see them. Now picture the millennials, the generation that turned their own coming of age into a decade-long cultural conversation, complete with think pieces and think fluencers and entire industries built around their anxiety. Two enormous groups loudly narrating their own existence, taking up every available square inch of cultural oxygen. And then there's you, standing in the hallway, holding a mixtape you made yourself, watching all of it happen. Not really invited to either party, not really sure you wanted to be. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, there's a good chance you've spent your entire adult life being the cultural middle child, overlooked, slightly underestimated, and privately okay with that in a way that's hard to explain. You're Gen X. And the psychology behind how you were formed is one of the most quietly fascinating stories in human development. Here's what nobody talks about. The way you were raised didn't just shape your personality, it literally restructured your relationship with independence, attachment, and trust in ways that neuroscience is only now beginning to fully map. This doesn't make you damaged, or cold, or emotionally unavailable. No matter how many times you've heard that one, it makes you something more complicated and more interesting than that. Psychologists call it self-directed coping, the neurological pattern that develops when a child learns, repeatedly, that external support is inconsistent. Not absent, inconsistent. That's the key word. You had parents, you had homes. But this was the era of latchkey kids, skyrocketing divorce rates, and a cultural philosophy that said children who struggled too much were probably being coddled. Developmental researcher Jean Twenge, alongside decades of attachment literature, shows that children raised in low supervision environments develop what's called an autonomous attachment orientation. Not avoidant, not anxious, but deeply internally regulated. You learned to be your own primary caretaker before you had language for what that meant. And the second concept is learned self-efficacy, first described by Albert Bandura in the 1970s. The psychological confidence that comes not from being told you're capable, but from actually solving things alone and surviving the outcome. For Gen X, that wasn't a therapy exercise. That was Tuesday. There's also something called resilience buffering, the documented psychological phenomenon where chronic low-level adversity, when not traumatic, builds a higher baseline tolerance for stress and ambiguity. Essentially, the fact that no one was watching too closely meant you had to develop an internal compass early, and those compasses tend to run quiet but accurate. Close your eyes for a second. You're 9 years old. It's 4 p.m. on a Wednesday. You let yourself into the house, your key is on a shoelace around your neck because your mom read that in a magazine. The TV hums. You make a bowl of cereal and you sit in the kitchen alone, and there is nobody asking you how your day was. And after a few minutes, you stop waiting for someone to ask. You watch something. You read something. You figure out dinner. And somewhere in that silence, without knowing it, you made a decision. I can handle this. I can handle most things. And I probably won't ask for help unless I'm absolutely certain I need it. That 9-year-old is still running the show right now, today. In the way you don't call when you're struggling until you've already mostly solved it. In the way you seem fine in a crisis, eerily fine, and then crash 2 weeks later when everyone else has moved on. In the way you sometimes don't know you needed someone until they're already gone. Here's the paradox at the heart of Gen X psychology. You are simultaneously the most self-sufficient people in any room and the ones most quietly hungry for someone to just show up without being asked. You don't perform need, which means people often don't know you have it. That paradox lives in your relationships in very specific ways. Gen X lovers tend to love laterally, as partners, not as caretakers or dependents. You don't cling, but you also don't always reach. You may have spent years with someone who loved you genuinely and still felt somehow like an island. Not because you didn't love them back, but because asking for comfort without a concrete reason felt like a kind of weakness your nervous system was trained very early to avoid. And when someone pushed too hard to get inside your walls, your first instinct wasn't anger, it was distance. Quiet, polite, total distance. But here's where honest complexity matters. Because this script isn't just here to validate you. Some of what looks like self-sufficiency is genuinely that, and some of it is a coping pattern that outlived its usefulness. The kid who learned not to need anyone had good reasons. The adult who still can't let anyone in may be protecting himself from a danger that isn't there anymore. Knowing which one you're doing on any given day, that's the actual work. Now flip the lens for a second, because if you love someone from Gen X, this part is for you. When they go quiet, you may read it as rejection. It isn't. When they seem fine while you're spiraling, you may read it as indifference. It isn't that either. What's actually happening is that their nervous system genuinely regulates differently. They don't escalate because escalation was never modeled as useful. They're not shutting you out. They're doing the only thing they know, which is handling it. If you want in, the move isn't to push harder, it's to be consistent over a long time. Because that's the one thing that was actually rare for them. Consistency is the language. Learn it. So what do you do with all of this? Not a life overhaul, just one small reframe. The next time you notice yourself handling something alone, not because you want to, but because asking felt impossible, try naming it. Not fixing it, just naming it. I'm doing the thing where I disappear into competence. That's it. Because what the research on autonomous attachment actually shows is that the pattern doesn't break through willpower. It softens through awareness and through enough repetitions of someone showing up anyway. You can't shortcut that, but you can start noticing when you're doing it. Gen X isn't the forgotten generation. They're the generation that learned to forget themselves for a while and then spent 30 years quietly, stubbornly, rebuilding from the inside out. They're not cold. They're careful. They're not disengaged. They're watching everything, filing it away, waiting to see if you're going to stay. They're the ones who show up when it actually matters. Without announcement, without credit, without needing a parade. They didn't grow up being told they were special, so they just got good. The question nobody asks out loud, if the self-sufficiency was built by the absence of consistent support, what does it mean that you've built your entire identity around not needing it? Is that freedom? Or is it a very old, very sophisticated defense you've stopped questioning? Sit with that one. If this channel is the first place you've heard your own psychology spoken back to you clearly, that's exactly why it exists. Subscribe because every week we go further into the science of why you are the way you are. And next week, we're talking about the psychology of people who feel emotions physically before they feel them mentally, and why that's not a disorder, it's a feature.